Okay, let me bring the text on the screen. Just give me one sec. Let's see here. Here we go. Okay. And once again, share this entire week is in memory of Joby's beloved father on the occasion of his recent yahrzeit. And let us continue with our learning today. We are up to Sif Beis. Finally, we got out of Sif Aleph after several days of studying all of the different commentaries. We're now in the Sif Beis of the Rab Shulchan Aruch, and let's see the text. It's on page Hey. V'chein mi sha'amar lechavero sheyitain lo matana v'lo nasan lo. Similarly, we're continuing this discussion of mechusar amana, of acting in poor faith, that if someone says to his friend that he's going to give him a gift, we had seen this case brought down before in the commentary, and the person does not make good on his verbal commitment to give his friend a gift, like he says, I'm going to drop off something for you. I have a book I want you to read, and I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to drop it off after Shabbos. And the guy never shows up. So, hareza mimuchusari amana. So such a person is one who acts in bad faith. And this is really something that, like we said before, the person is called a rasha for having brought someone's hopes up and then not making good on those promises. But when is this true? Only when it comes to a small gift. Because when it comes to a small gift, meaning something that's not incredibly valuable, is that the person who is the supposed recipient has reliance on that person's words that he's going to make good. And when he doesn't, there's a violation of ben adam lachavera, that you've brought someone's hopes up and then disappointed that person and caused that person pain. Aval b'matana meruba ein ba chisaron amana. However, if it's a major gift, like a person says, I'm going to give you my car. That was the example that I gave before. Or a person says that what would be another example? Anything where that the recipient does not have a sense of reliance on that promise until there is some kind of kinyan or some kind of contract drawn up. Shaharei lo hemin zeh sheyitin lo dvarim elu ad sheyikna osam b'dvarim shehim niknim bahem. He says, because the recipient himself realizes that that is a gift of such large proportions that it's not going to happen until it happens, or until there's a legal kinyan that is transacted to make sure that this is a legal transfer. So if I tell you I'm going to give you my car, then you're not relying on the fact that you're going to get my car unless we draw up papers and I transfer title and so forth and so on. Okay. But now, so this is something, this up until now we've seen this already. And then the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, Umechila eina tzricha kinyan. Now, when it comes to forgiveness of a loan, if let's say I've lent someone money and I go to that person and I say, you don't have to pay me back. You don't have to pay me back. So that kind of forgiveness does not require any transaction in order to be final. All it needs is a verbal declaration. Ela im kain haisa b'taus, sha'az af kinyan enu moa. unless the forgiveness of the loan was done in error, in which case, even if a transactional kinyan is affected, then that will not help either. In other words, I lent a guy money, and my understanding was that he didn't have the wherewithal to pay me back the money. Next thing I hear is that he's booked for Pesach on a Pesach program. So imagine how irate I am. So therefore, initially when I told him I forgave the loan, it's because I figured Nebuch, he doesn't have the money to pay me back. But you're going on a Pesach program and you didn't bother paying me back the $1,000 that I lent you? How could that be? So then it's legal and perfectly legit for you to go back to the guy and say, I'm sorry, the forgiveness of the loan was under false pretenses. So then he'll give you a whole song and dance. Well, I really can't afford the Pesach program. My in-laws are paying me for me to go. And then you got to figure out, what are you going to say to the guy? And it becomes very uncomfortable, right? But the point is that that many times, if a mechila is done under false pretenses, you're allowed to undo it. Umikol makom b'shah she'omer lo litein lo tzarech lihios b'da'as gemura v'lo yehi b'daito l'shanos. But at the end of the day, when you give your word to someone that you're going to give them a gift, it has to be with full intent. Meaning that up until now we've been talking, and the biurim that we saw yesterday, we made a point of saying this. The whole point of dover emes bilvavo, speaking truth in your heart, is that you have to follow through on your commitments. Okay? But there's something even worse than that. And that is that if I tell someone I'm going to do something for them or I'm going to give them something, and I don't follow through, okay, that's the first level. That's mechusar amana. But what if I tell someone I'm going to do something for them, I'm going to give them something, and I know at the time that I'm saying it, that what I'm saying is absolutely false. I'm saying what I'm saying, I know I'm not going to do it, but I just want to get them off my back, or I want them to feel good, but I have absolutely no intention of making good on this commitment. So that absolutely is usher. Kiladaber echad bepev ve'echad belev. Let me turn the page. Usher min haTorah. That's an usher deoraisa. To speak with one echad bepev ve'echad belev means with one mouth and with a different heart. Meaning that what you're saying with your mouth is totally different from what your thoughts are, is an Isser Deoraisa. Shenemar, Eifas Tzedek V'hin Tzedek Yihiyeh. Because the Torah says in Parshas Kedoshim that you shall have an Eifa that is correct and a hin that is correct. Now these are two different kinds of weights. An Eifa is an Eifa and a hin are weights that are, one is larger than the other. The Eifa is larger than the hin. Let's say a hin is maybe half of an Eifa. And so the Gemara asks the question, Ma talmud lomar hin tzedek, v'halo hin bichlal Eifa. He says, they're both include, all you need to say is the larger weight, and you'll know that the smaller weight has to be accurate. If the larger weight has to be absolutely accurate, then surely the smaller weight has to be accurate as well. So why does the Torah have to say both? Ela sheyehei hein shel chatzedek v'lav shel chatzedek. The word hein or hin can be read as hein, which means yes in Aramaic, and that tells me that your yes should be correct and your no shall be correct, meaning that you're not allowed to speak falsely, speak with a forked tongue, as they say. Okay, so that's the halacha in the Rav Shulchan Aruch for today. Now we're going to look at the Imrei Yaakov for the commentary. And a lot of these things, the reason why there's much less commentary is because we've covered a lot of these issues already in the first sif. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov, sif katan ches lechavero. If you tell your friend, Dafka im omar lo bifanav. Aval im omar shelo bifanav yesh omrim demuter lachzor bo. He says, this whole halacha is when you tell the friend directly. But according to some opinions, if you say to a third party, I'm going to give him this book, he's got to read it, or I'm going to give him this gift, so then since you never told that person directly, then lechatchila you would be allowed to change your mind. Because since there's no sense of reliance, and that person is not going to feel that sense of disappointment when he doesn't receive the gift, because it was only related to a third party, so some people say that you're allowed to go back on the deal. Now, one could argue that this would depend on whether the other person heard about it. But even if he heard about it, the recipient heard about it, he might say to himself, well, how do I know if he was serious? He didn't tell me. And as long as he didn't tell me, then he's not going to have full reliance, and therefore it's not as bad for a person to go back on his word.
Might it matter who that, sorry for interrupting, might it matter who that third party is? I mean, if he told someone's spouse, or like I'm just thinking that at some point, it's almost like you're being told yourself.
Yes, you're right. And also, and let me give you another what if. What if he tells the third party, tell that guy that I'm going to give it to him, right? So again, we're learning about the vanilla case. There may be a lot of different shades of that would change. You're right. He says, and some say that if you tell a child that you're going to give them a gift, then that's considered to be not in front of the child. And what's the reason? You know what? I didn't have a chance to research this particular halacha about a child. I think I'm going to look into this a little bit further. But some people say that a child is not subject to the same level of reliance and disappointment. And then he brings v'yesh omrim de'ein lechalek. And some say that no, there's no difference. And then in all situations, whether you speak to a third party or whether you speak to a child, then it's always going to be mechusar aman if you don't make good with your word. V'im omar laseis lekatan ezer davar avor pu'ulaso o shlichuso vaday chayiv laseis lo. And if you tell a child that if he does a certain chore, or if he does you a certain favor, then you'll give him something, then obviously you have to make good on that. Va'over beval tolin. And not only that, but you'd be liable for an isser deoraisa of what's called baal talin, that the Torah says you're not allowed to withhold wages or delay paying a worker. The isser of baal talin is that if you hire someone and payment is due immediately upon delivery of service, and you delay the payment, then there's an isser deoraisa called baal talin, which will probably, we'll get into that at some point later in the laws of Choshen Mishpat, because baal talin is employer-employee relations, right? But that employer obligations apply even to a minor. If you employ a child to do a job for you and you don't pay him, then you're certainly over not only on mechusar amana, but you're liable for baal talin, for not compensating someone for after you hired them to do something for you. So this all, I think this all goes without saying. Promising a child that you're going to give them a gift and not making good on that gift, while the poskim may debate whether there's mechusar amana or not, certainly an educational expert would tell you that's probably the worst thing that you can do to a child, because by promising them something and then not making good on it will certainly train the child that your word is not your bond, and that he doesn't have to be careful about his word either. So I'll try and look into this a little bit more for tomorrow's shiur to be able to present you with a little bit more about that. Okay. Yeah.
Was it, I'm trying to remember, was there something in the Gemara about when you give something to a child, have them mess up their face, so the parent asks, "Where did you get that from?" And then I'm not sure whether that's related to it, but I think there was something about this relationship between an
That's
adult and a
yeah,
child.
yeah. You have a good memory, Paul. It's a different halacha though. That the Gemara is teaching us derech eretz, that when you give a child a gift, it's important that the parent knows about it. And the reason why it's important for the parent to know about it is because you generate goodwill between yourself and the child's parent by notifying them that your child has been enriched in some way by you. So you're supposed to, if you give a child, I forget what it was, if you give a child like a treat, you're supposed to put something on their face or on their hair to show that they've had an interchange with an adult, so that when the child gets back, the parent will say, "Who did that to your hair?" And they'll tell the whole story about how, "Oh, this very nice man, he's a friend of yours from shul, and he gave me a candy," or whatever it is. Okay. So, mimechusare amana, that is the next part is he's acting in bad faith if he promises a gift and doesn't make good on it. V'zemi takanas chacham. What we've said now is a rabbinic law. Avim min haTorah eno over. He says, but midioraisa, you're not in violation of a mitzvah if you sincerely mean at the time that you say it that you're going to do this favor or gift this gift to a person at the time when you say it. But if at the time that you said it, you never meant it, so then you're doing not only an Isser D'Rabbanan, but an Isser D'Oraisa as well. And then we said, B'matana Meruba, that this doesn't apply when you promise to give someone a gift of large proportions, because the recipient does not have reliance on your word, because everyone knows that to receive a gift of that size, there has to be some kind of legal documentation to record the transfer. V'im hivtiach lo be'emunaso, dahainu ma shenahug lifa'amim lomar be'emunah shali. Now, what happens if a person says to him, "You can trust me"? In other words, when we're talking about my car, right? I tell a guy, "I'm going to give you my car." So if I tell a guy, "You know what? I think I'm going to give you my car," so then there's no chisar amana if I decide later on that it's not a good idea, because I spoke to my wife, right? However, let's say I tell the guy, not only am I going to give you my car, but I tell him, "You know what? Be'emunah shali," or I promise you, or you can my word is my bond. You can trust me on this one. This is something that I absolutely guarantee that I'm going to give you. Az afilu b'matana meruba sam chadaita v'asur lachzor bo. So when you use that kind of added language, so then there is a reliance. You've created a greater sense of reliance, and then too, you would be a mechusar amana if you go back on the deal and you're not supposed to. And let's go even further. That when a person promises a large exorbitant gift, there's no mechusar amana if he goes back on it. That's when we're dealing with the gifter is a regular person of humble means. But let's say the person making the verbal commitment is a very wealthy person. So when he says he's going to give me a car, so then I rely on that, because for him, a car is a small gift, because it's a trifle for him. And so therefore, again, a lot of it will depend on the circumstances. And what's called large and what's called small is in relation to the financial ability of the person making the gift. Next. Umechila. When it comes to...
Could I just ask a quick question? Could it also be based on the situation, such as somebody turns around and says, I have a job opportunity, but it's out in Oakville and I don't have a car, and you turn around and you say, "You know what? Don't worry about it. I'll give you a car." Or don't you say, "I'll give you a car." suddenly the person is actually relying on it because of the situation.
Right. That would be a situation of hiftiach lo be'amunato, where the circumstances are that it's clear that this commitment is being made with a sense of reliance to the recipient, because basically the person with the car is basically saying, accept the job, don't worry about it, I'll make sure that you get a car. You're absolutely right, Eddie. It's a valid point. In other words, it all depends on the situation. It's a good example. Yud Aleph, umechila. When it comes to forgiving a loan, so you can forgive a loan verbally, and once you forgive a loan verbally, it is a legal commitment. Yesh omrim da afilu hayalo shtar o mashkon afilu hachi havi mechilasa mechila bidvarim bilvad. And some go so far as to say that this verbal forgiveness of a loan is true even when there's a promissory note, and even when collateral was given. If the creditor says, I forgive the loan is forgiven, and then at that point he's obligated to destroy the contract or return the collateral. The yesh cholkin al zeh usvir le davi sveka dedina. But others disagree, and they say that it's not so clear cut. And therefore, in that kind of situation, it may come to a point where you have to go to Beis Din, and you have to have the Beis Din adjudicate on that matter. Vida, and then he says, but you should also know the inyan mechila lo shayach ela b'chov, that this whole concept of forgiving a loan is only when there's a cash loan. Avalim hayalo chayfetz o pikadon mos biyad chavero v'amar le'macholach eno klum. But if I've given you an object or a specific envelope full of cash that I've asked you to watch and not to spend, that's what's called a pikadon. That's not called a halva. That's not called a loan. A loan is where I've given you money to spend. That I can forgive verbally. But if there's a specific object that I've asked you to keep in my house, in your house for safekeeping for me, and then I tell you, you know what? That object that I left with you, you can keep it. That's not a legal commitment, and I have a right afterwards to say that I need it back. Now, whether or not there's a mechusar amana, it seems like there's not even a mechusar amana in that case. But at least, maybe it'll depend on the circumstances, obviously. But this is an important caveat, that when it's a specific item, then there has to be an actual kinyan. And I'm not sure exactly what that kinyan would be comprised of, but it could be that you would have to say it in front of Eidim, and then there would have to be let's say maybe a kinyan affected, or a handshake, or perhaps there would be a declaration that the person holding on to the object has to make a kinyan with his property, or however it's going to work. But the bottom line is that just a private conversation does not have any legal import in halacha. Now, going back to the idea of forgiving a loan can be done verbally without any kinyan. Va'afilu imachal shelo b'fanav, and even if the person forgave the loan without the debtor being present, mikol makom mo'il ha'mechila, but nonetheless the mechila works. Aval dafka im machal al yedei dibur, but that's only if you did a verbal forgiveness. So this is important. If a person makes a declaration that is heard by others, and he says, I hereby forgive the loan, I forgive the debt that Plony owes me money, then he doesn't even have to be present. As long as people have heard him make that declaration, then that is a legal declaration. But that's only if he made it verbally. Aval mechila belev, after yesh amrim dahabi mechila, mikol makom harbe poskim iskimu delo habe mechila. He says, but a mental declaration, like in other words, I say to myself, you know what? I have rachmanis on this guy. I'm not going to ask him back for the money. But it's a thought that you have. You've never made that statement. You just are thinking that, I'm really not going to ask him to pay me back the money. There are some who say that you have to make good on that. That's almost like doing an act of tzedakah, right? But there are many poskim who say that that's not considered a mechila. V'ayin od lekamen siman yud gimel sif yud aleph b'imrei Yaakov v'likutim sham kama inyanim b'dinei mechila. We'll get into this a little bit later on in siman yud gimel, which is, we're now just in siman aleph. So there's a lot of other details in the laws of mechila that we'll have to get into later on.
But I wonder whether there's a distinction between forgiving because you really don't want him to have to pay the debt back anymore, or you've just kind of given up. You said, I don't think I'm ever going to see that money again. I'm just kind of writing off that ability to collect.
That's what we would call yeush, right?
Yeush, yeah.
Yeah.
So is there a difference between those two utterances?
I think so. I think there is a difference because yeush is just a pragmatic realization that I can no longer rely on getting that money back, but I haven't formally forgiven the loan. I've just basically said that it's unlikely I'll ever see it again. When it comes to lost items, yeush actually works to allow other people to take possession of a lost item. But I don't think that it applies with a loan, because if someone steals something, they still the robber or the ganef, the thief still has an obligation to return it to me, even after yeush. So certainly the person who's the debtor still has a Torah obligation to pay back his debt, even after the creditor has given up hope of ever getting it back. It's possible that the debtor can later ask the creditor, will you formally be moichel? And then it's the creditor's discretion. But I don't think that he's obligated to be moichel, nor is the debtor off the hook just because he's given up hope of ever getting it back. I think we're going to hold it for today because I got to run to daven and then give the daf. So I want to wish you all a great day.
Correct, Rabbi. Good day, gentlemen. Take care.
Have a great day.
See some of you shortly.